Shalom Nukulam, Shavua Tov. Again, apologies for my absence. Thank you so much for your understanding. And today we continue our learning about the Tanaim and Amoraim. In fact, today we're going to be starting to work towards bridging from the Anshe Knesset Agdolah to the Zugot to the Tanaim by introducing the personalities of Hillel and Shammai, and of course their students known generally as Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So I'm going to share my screen. I believe that you have also now received this handout. And what we're going to do is, as we do in every week, read through some teachings from Rabbi Dr. Benny Lau, Gershom Beda, Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Yaakov Haber, and discuss, analyze, and explore who were Hillel, who was Shammai, what is Beit Hillel, what is Beit Shammai, and why they're so important in terms of the transmission of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which we celebrate, we learn, we enjoy, and which guides every single thing that we do. So we begin with Benny Lau, and he says as follows: Hillel was born to a Babylonian family of good lineage, about 4 centuries after the era of Simon the Just, Shimon HaTzadik. That means that Hillel was born about 4 centuries after the period that we initially spoke of, the transmission from the Anshe Knesset Agdolah to the Zugot, and he was born about a century before the Churban Beit Sheni. So we're talking about halfway through the last century before the Common Era. Now, though the Tanaim lived in Eretz Israel, Hillel was born in Bavel. And actually, he was born to a financially comfortable family, and that's going to prove significant because there's a story that's going to be told where he has no money. In fact, he goes to the roof of the Beit Midrash in order to learn Torah from the roof. Why does he come from Bavel to Eretz Israel? Well, the short answer is that there are different traditions being developed. He lives in Bavel, he's learning from the scholars in Bavel, but he realizes the place to be in order to learn the Torah as being taught, as being transmitted, the purest form of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, so that he can be a chain in that tradition, is in Eretz Israel. And so he comes to Israel not for Gashmi reasons. In fact, as I say, he goes from a good lineage and with a comfortable family to poverty. Instead, he comes for spiritual reasons. And this is itself going to be part and parcel of his spiritual biography that we're going to be learning about. So he arrives in the land of Israel, and who does he serve under? Who does he learn from? Shammai of Talion, in a state of abject poverty. I want us to focus on that word, served under. It doesn't just say he learnt from. Served in terms of rabbinic language is shimesh. He was able to be of service to. He didn't just sit in the classes, but he listened, he paid attention. He was an assistant to Shammai of Talion. And that word shimush is going to prove very, very significant when we talk about the shift from Hillel and Shammai to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We're told he later achieved greatness, taking his place as a patriarch of Israel and as a link connecting the era of the pairs of Zugot with the period of the Tanaim, like I said in my introduction. So Hillel becomes a bridge between the Zugot and that of the Tanaim. Now, Hillel's life spanned the Herodian era, which began in 37 before the Common Era and lasted until the beginning of the 1st century CE. Herod's reign marks the final transition from the Hasmonean state to Roman sovereignty. Now, by the way, don't be deceived just because we've mentioned the year 37 before the Common Era, and Hillel certainly dies before Churban Beit Sheni. We shouldn't assume we know how old Hillel is. There is a classic tradition that he dies at the age of 120. Others have pushed back and said that he died at the age of 80. But that being said, we can't learn too much. Still, we know that he spanned the final century before the Common Era to the beginning of the Common Era. And he becomes, as we said, this bridge. Now, although Hillel the Elder was the most famous student of Shammai of Talion, he was in fact preceded by a less well-known disciple named Menachem. Now, we're going to talk about Menachem right now because he's going to be important in terms of understanding what's going on at the time. So though Hillel the elder was the most famous student, he was preceded by Menachem. And where do we learn about Menachem? From a Mishnah in Masechet Chagiga. Now, in fact, this Mishnah doesn't just begin with Shmaya. It talks about all the Zugot and talks about how one held one view or one held another. Here we're talking about the smicha, the leaning of hands on an offering to be brought on a festival. And we're told in the Mishnah, Shammai said he may lay his hands. There's a debate whether one may do that on a festival, one may put pressure on an animal on a festive day, on a chag. Shammai says yes, Avtalion says he may not. Okay, it's a machloket, Shammai and Avtalion, as I mentioned before, with previous sugot as well, about whether smich can be done on the chagim. Hillel and Menachem did not differ. So Hillel and seemingly his friend or perhaps counterpart, Menachem, share the same view. Menachem left, Menachem yatza, and Shammai replaced him. Well, if Shammai replaces him, that means that Menachem was Hillel's counterpart. And Shammai says not to lay, and Hillel says to lay. So, seemingly beforehand, Hillel and Menachem took the view that one may do smicha on a chag, and then Shammai came along and disagreed, and he said, I continue with the tradition of Avtalion, who says you're not allowed to do smicha on the chag. Now concludes the Mishnah, the former were patriarchs and the later were heads of the court. To use the correct language, the former, meaning whenever we mentioned a couplet of these pairs, namely Shammai and Avtalion, Hillel and Shammai, the first person mentioned was a Nasi, a patriarch, and the later was the head of the court, was an Av Beit Din. So we've previously mentioned how the Zugot, one was a Nasi, one is an Av Beit Din. Where do we learn that from? We learned it from this Mishnah, Masechet Chagiga, which gives us a rule of thumb. Whenever you have a pair of the Zugot, the former was a Nasi, the second, the latter, was an Av Beit Din. However, Ben Hillel brings this Mishnah not for no reason. Instead, he does so in order for us to realize that there was somebody who precedes Shammai called Menachem. So who is Menachem? Where is he from? And where does he go? That's the question. So continues Ben Hillel, the Babylonian Talmud records a dispute regarding where Menachem actually went to. And so we're told the following. Remember, the Lashon in the Mishnah was Yatza Menachem, Menachem left, and Shammai replaced him. Ask the Gemara, where did he go? According to Abaya, he left for the path of evil, the Tarbut Ra'ah. You know, when people choose the wrong path, they go off the derech, as they call it. The language of the rabbis is a Tarbut Ra'ah, literally to an evil culture, to the wrong way of being. Rava disagrees, and instead he says, Lavodat HaMelech, Menachem goes to join the king's service. Continues the Gemara, we also learned this in a Braita, Menachem left to serve the king, and 80 pairs of students dressed in silk official military attire went with him. Now, what we learn from here is that Menachem, leaving the classic rabbinic model alongside the Nasi, Hillel, and joining the king's service, which seems to be the more accurate historical record because we have a Beit which supports that, was a big deal. Because he didn't just go on his own, he went with 80 pairs of students, all in their finery, etc. Now continues Ben Hillel, the king's service, Lavodat HaMelech, means enlistment into the army. This period of increased affiliation with Rome had many effects, some commendable and others deplorable. The expression Menachem left, Yatza Menachem, places him on the outside. With the foundations of the state crumbling, there was widespread vacillation between the glistening new world of Antipatris and Rome and the world of hard labor that characterized Judea at the time. Meaning, there seems to be two paths to choose from if you want a good life. One is a path of physical benefit, which is the dazzling world of anti-patrician Rome, or the hard and tough world of Judea, Judah. And of course, the Jews are from Judea. But Menachem Yatza, or Yatza Menachem, he left, he weft and joined the army. By the way, maybe Abaya is actually saying the same thing that Talmud Ra'ah. He's instead focusing on what Menachem did. Instead, he's talking about the significance, the consequence of what Menachem went to do. The Talmud Ra'ah. But what we learn from here is that it wasn't originally Hillel and Shammai, instead it was Hillel and Menachem. And the gap between them actually at the beginning was small. Remember, they agreed on the topic of smicha, and then comes along Shammai and disagrees. That being said, the cultural gap between them seems to have been great because Menachem left. Now, so far we've learnt a little bit about Hillel and we've learnt a little bit about Menachem. How about Shammai? Well, continues Ben Hillel, our information on Shammai's origins is scant. We don't know almost anything about where he came from, and there are no explicitly biographical sources. He usually appears as Hillel's halachic opponent, that we know, and a number of the rulings attributed to him shed light on his character and his religious stance. We're going to come back to that soon. But here, Ben Hillel makes a brief comment on this topic. Shammai's halachic approach has been characterized in two different ways. By the way, it's been characterized in more than that, as an attempt to preserve early halacha, or as a conservative tendency to halachic rigidity. We'll see that a whole bunch of scholars have tried to give some kind of descriptive account of what marks the difference between the halachic worldview of Hillel and Shammai, and certainly the halachic worldview of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. But as we see here, when Menachem leaves, Shammai comes along, and he's different. He has a very different worldview. He disagrees with Hillel on the topic of smicha, but more than that, he disagrees with Hillel on a number of other topics as well. Just as a quick aside, often we think about the many debates between Hillel and Shammai. Actually, according to our tradition, we have this in Mishnah Eduyot, Hillel and Shammai themselves only have 3-4 disagreements recorded. Meaning we don't have many machlakot between Hillel and Shammai recorded in our tradition. Whereas Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, there's at least 300 machlakot between the two. This itself is hugely symbolic and hugely significant. It suggests that there is a devolution when it comes to the maintenance of traditions from the period of Hillel and Shammai to that of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now continues Ben Hillel, arriving in the land of Israel, Hillel found himself in a society where, for most people, the Torah was a closed, esoteric tradition transmitted exclusively among the members of an aristocratic elite group. Earlier, we focused on Hillel's heroic night-type vigil. We mentioned this before, and it's a Gemara in Yoma, studying Torah while freezing in the snow on the roof of the Bet Midrash, just because he was too poor to pay the entrance fee. Hillel was prepared to almost freeze to death in order to study Torah. In the Talmud, this episode becomes a benchmark for the obligation on every person to study Torah. Responding to a world that sought to limit the Torah's accessibility to society at large, Hillel took the approach of raising many students. Remember, we see that in the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. It's the teaching of the Anshe Knesset Agdolah, heralding a new era in which the Torah was open to all those who wished to study it. So what we have here is a little bit more information about Hillel than we have about Shammai, and the anomaly or the confusing yet fascinating personality of Menachem therein. We've mentioned that there seems to be different approaches of Hillel and Shammai, although we only have a handful of disagreements between themselves, though there are much more disagreements between their schools of thought between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We know there's been an economic transition of Hillel from being richer to being poorer. We'll come back to that soon, because that seems to have sensitized him to those who were poor. And at the same time, there seems to be an emphasis of Hillel, of Torah, the democratization of Torah study, that Torah shouldn't just be an elite thing, but instead accessible to all. The irony, therefore, being because he couldn't afford Torah learning, but he still wishes to learn it. And in so doing, he's proving a point. Torah should not be limited to those who can just afford it. It shouldn't be just for the aristocratic or the elite. It should be for everyone. Ad Kan, this piece by Ben Hillel. By the way, this is taken from a number of pages of volume 1 of the Sages of Chachamim, and he has other information there too, which is fascinating and worthwhile reading. Let us now have a look at a piece from Rabbi Yaakov Haber's Lev Avot. And this itself is really quite fascinating. It in fact includes a detail that I was unaware of until he presented it here. And so Rabbi Haber begins by telling us, Hillel haya ben 40 shana k'she'ala miBavel le'Eretz Yisrael. Hillel, according to tradition, was 40 when he moved from Babylon to the land of Israel. V'alach lilmod etzel Shammai v'Avtalyon 40 shana. And according to that tradition, he learnt Torah from Shammai and Avtalyon for another 40 years, making him 80. Remember, I said to you before that according to the major rabbinic tradition, he lived the age of 120. There are others who've pushed back, and this is discussed, if I'm not mistaken, by Rabbi Haber and by others as well. I think by Rabbi Lerner, who mentions it also. When he was 80 years old, he was afforded the position, he was coronated, shall we say, as a Nasi, as an exilarch of Klal Yisrael. He actually came from his mother's side from the Davidic dynasty. Sorry, that should say Bet David. He was the first to restore the Nesiut to those belonging to the dynasty of the house of David after it had been taken by the Hashmonaim. Now, we discussed this in previous weeks, how the Hashmonaim appointed themselves as both high priests and kings, despite not coming from Bet David. Hillel is restorative in as much as that he's trying to, or his appointment signifies a certain restoration of the crown to its correct glory. Now, where is that significant and why is that significant? We mentioned before in our earlier sessions that the Anshe Knesset Agdolah instituted a lot of the prayers that we have. But that doesn't mean that all the prayers that we have were instituted by Anshe Knesset Agdolah. Instead, many of them, and some were added later on for various reasons at certain periods of time in response to certain particular events. Well, says Rabbi Haber, V'yitkinu as, in this time, in the time of Hillel, taking over the Nesiut, right, and representing that sense of the restoration of the house of David to the leadership of the Jewish people, Hitkinu az bracha et tzemach David avdecha. One of the tefillot, one of the brachot in the Amidah, which talks about David returning, or the dynasty of David returning to the leadership of the Jewish people, says Rabbi Haber, this prayer, this tefillah, was composed and reflects that restoration as reflected by the Nesiut of Hillel. And then he goes on and he says, "Ubirchat samchenu shebirchat haftorah sheomrim ba v'al kis'o lo yeshev zar v'zar hu mi she'enu mishpachat Bet David." In addition to that, the prayers that we say before and after the reading of the Haftarah on Shabbat makes reference to the idea al kis'o lo yeshev zar. A stranger should not sit in the throne. Instead, the people who are leading the Jewish nation should be from Bet David, and this apparently is also an allusion to the Hashmonaim. It's a slight to them, and at the same time, it's an affirmation and a celebration of Hillel in terms of his Nesiut and bringing things back to how things should be. So this itself is fascinating. I've mentioned already a couple of times how the Lev Avot Sefer is so wonderful. This is a tidbit that changes the way in which we look at the Amida, changes the way in which we hear the Birkot, Haftarah, changes the way we think about Hillel and what he is and what he represents. So it's something which I'm so pleased to have shared with you. Let us now move on to Pirkei Avot, because of course we're using Pirkei Avot to learn the traditions associated with each of these great teachers. In this case now, Hillel and Shammai. Of course, if Menachem would have stayed around, it would have been Hillel and Menachem. What's noticeable before we even start learning the Mishnayot is, unlike other Zugot where there was two Mishnayot, one for one and one for the other, one for the Nasi and one for the Abbetin, here we have four Mishnayot, right? From Yud Bet to Tedvav, Uyar Shammai Omer, three of the teachings from Hillel, each, of course, containing a number of statements, and a further teaching from Shammai. So when you look at the list, when you go from Anshe Knesset Gdolah and Yosef ben Yoezer v'chule, noting that Hillel and Shammai get so much space, have so many teachings, I think is there to emphasize their significance in terms of the transmission of the Torah Sheba'al Peh from the Zugot to the Tanaim. Having said that, let's now learn what Hillel says and what Shammai says, because as we've noticed already since we began this course, paying attention to what is said while understanding the context of the poskim, of the teachers, then helps us better appreciate what is being said. Hillel v'Shammai kiblu mehem. So they received from Shema and Avtalion. We've already said that. Hillel said, Havim mitamidav shel Aaron, ohev shalom, rodef shalom, ohev et habriot, mukarvan haTorah. Be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving mankind and drawing them close to the Torah. And of course, the reference to Aaron perhaps is also indicative of the Malchut Bet David association, this idea not that Aaron is, but instead because it represents that sense of authenticity of religious leadership, of spiritual leadership. But Begadol, we know from the teachings of Hillel that he was somebody who pursued and promoted Achdut, and so Jewish unity. And so the first teaching of Hillel, Havim and Aaron, is to go in the way of celebrating and emphasizing and promoting Jewish unity. Ohev shalom, rodef shalom, ohev et habriot, u'makarban haTorah. And of course, that story that we know from Masechet Shabbat of teaching the ger on 1 foot, and he says, don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself, is reflective of the centrality of shalom and the kind of positive sentiments which Hillel shares through that teaching. However, that's not the only teaching of Hillel here in Pirkei Avot. The next says, Hoyamel, he used to say, this is still Hillel, Naged Shma, Abed Shmei. One who makes his name great causes his name to be destroyed. Odlo Mosif Yosef, and one who does not add to his knowledge causes it to cease. Odlo Yalef Katala Chayav, and one who does not study Torah deserves death. Udishtamesh betaga chalef, and one who makes unworthy use of the crown of learning shall pass away. Now you may well say, what is this talking about? He went from this much more gentle and generous sentiment of being of the disciples of Aaron, but now Hillel seems to be a little bit firmer, right? What is being discussed here? Well, according to Rabbi Heber in his commentary, and I didn't bring it here, but I'm just referencing it. According to Rabbi Heber in his commentary, Lev Avot, this is a reference to Menachem. Remember, Menachem was Hillel's counterpart. And then what happens to Menachem? According to one view, he halach letarbut ra'ah. According to another, he went off to the king's army. But basically, he went off. And I'm just going to quote to you what Rabbi Heber says. He says, I believe that there's an allusion in this Mishnah to Menachem, Lechatchila haya Menachem zugo shel Hillel. Initially, Menachem was his counterpart. V'azav et derech haTorah. He left the path of Torah. V'alav amar Hillel nagid shmei abed shmei. It's about him that he says, one who makes his name great causes his name to be destroyed. One who does not add his knowledge causes it to cease. Now, you may well wonder, why is it that this teaching is in Aramaic when everything else is in Rabbinic Hebrew? Have you ever noticed that? Isn't it strange? All the other teachings are in Rabbinic Hebrew, and this one's in Aramaic. And the one before is from Hillel, the one after is from Hillel. All of a sudden, Hillel wants to talk in a different language. What brought him to do so? Says Rabbi Heber, "Shediber ba'aramit, amishu moneh et atzmo mililmod Torah." He spoke in Aramaic about somebody who makes choices which leads him to not be involved in Torah. Mishtamesh bekitra shel Torah, and somebody who uses the honor of Torah for ulterior motives. V'kavanato hayta al chavero. He continues, and his intention was about his friend, his counterpart Menachem. V'diber ba'aramit b'chdei shelo yavin hurdus et dvarav she'ohavo et Menachem. And he spoke in Aramaic, so Hurdus doesn't understand what he's saying. So Herod doesn't understand what he's saying. Isn't it fascinating? According to Rabbi Heber, the reason why this Mishnah is in Aramaic is to make sure that Herod doesn't understand what is being said, which is a slight to Menachem, who then went to the king, right? He is saying, "What happened to you, my friend?" But he doesn't want Herod to know that that's what he's saying, so he says it in slightly more poetic, slightly more cryptic language. He says it in a different language. Of course, he himself was in Bavel, and that's why we have what we have. Isn't that a wonderful way to make sense of a Mishnah, which perhaps was a closed book to all of us because we didn't understand why this is in this language, why that is in that language. Now we have the third teaching of Hillel. This is perhaps the most famous. Im en ani li mili. If I'm not for myself, who is for me? Kshani latzmi mani. If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Now, we know Hillel is somebody who's an Imlo Achshav Matai guy because he travels from Bavel to Eretz Israel. He recognizes there are opportunities you have to seize. He also has a sense of duty for the Jewish people, right? So, Kshani latzmi mani. But he also knows in order to do that, in order to learn for others, he has to learn for himself. So this is arguably a certain bit of a spiritual autobiography. You know, we may well think he's talking to us. Maybe he's actually talking about himself. And how do I know that? Because it says ani. He's not talking about Atem. He's talking about me. I, Hillel. And this seems to have been a motto of his to justify and explain and support and inspire his own choices. Now we come to Shammai. Shammai Omer, Aseh Toratcha keva, make your study of the Torah a fixed practice. Emor me'at oseh harbeh, v'mekabel et kol adam b'seva panim yafot. Speak little, do much, and receive all people with a pleasant countenance. Now, by the way in which we represent or misrepresent Shammai would suggest he didn't receive all people with a pleasant countenance. Of course, that's a slight to him, and that's not the case. Still, it's notable that this is what is, associated with. This is his teaching. This is Shammai too. Shammai is a complicated person, and we do well to lean in and think more about what is he coming to share, what is he coming to teach. You'll recall what Ben Hillel said about Hillel's approach to Talmud Torah and wishing to democratize Talmud Torah. So when we have here Shammai Omer Aseh Toratcha keva, he's talking perhaps about the individual learner. They should have a fixed time of kviyas of limud Torah, but perhaps it's also a certain sense of being strict regarding fixing the Torah in a certain particular way. Let's now talk a little bit more about the personalities of Hillel and Shammai. And there is a oft quoted description of Hillel and Shammai just before we have those stories of the meeting of the convert, etc. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages say, Lo'olam yehe adam anvatan ki Hillel, bal yehe kaptan ke Shammai. Now this is translated to mean a person should always be patient like Hillel and not impatient like Shammai. ArtScroll translates kaptan as being stern. Some people may translate it as particular or in a finicky, perhaps. How we understand the kapdanut of Shammai becomes very significant when we learn through his teachings and his legacy in terms of Beit Shammai. But these become the broad categories to which we fit the personalities of Hillel and Shammai, even though, of course, we have numerous teachings of each of them, but in terms of actually machlakot, as I say, actually quite few. So Hillel is considered to be the anvatan, and Shammai is considered to be the kapdan. Let's now see how Gershom Beder describes the personalities of Hillel and Shammai, we'll see whether what he says is both provable and demonstrable from some of the teachings that we know of and that we'll perhaps encounter. So he now tells us, Hillel was the first of the authors of the Mishnah who insisted the object of religion is to enforce the fulfillment of the duties of one man towards another, and that all practical commandments are but a means to this end. He describes Hillel as being somebody who emphasizes basically the chesed dimension of Jewish living, and we do have numerous teachings where we encounter that expression of Hillel. He therefore established the principle of brotherly love as a main condition for all the commandments of the Torah. Where do we see this? Famously in the Gemara in the Shabbos, once when a Gentile wanted to adopt Judaism on one condition, that he be taught the whole Torah in the time that he could stand on one foot, Hillel gave him but one rule. Do not unto thy neighbor what you would not have him do unto you. This is a whole Jewish law, he said. All else are but commentaries on their commandment, which you will know when you study them. So this response seems to reflect the general way in which Gershom Beder is describing Hillel, that the object of religion is to enforce fulfillment of the duties of one man towards another. Hillel was very gentle in his relations with other people and suffered their capricious behavior without anger. And there's numerous instances where people would wind up Hillel and he didn't respond. He particularly insists on showing friendship to the poor. Now, why? Well, perhaps because he simply believed that's the right thing to do. But remember, he came from money and then he came to Israel and was poor. He remembered what it meant to be poor. Not only did he provide them with necessities, but he also with such luxuries as they were previously unused to. This is based on the principle we learn in Pasha Re'eh of Dei Machzor Asher Yachsar Lo, from which we learn in Gemara and Ketubot that if somebody is affluent and falls on hard times, not only should we give them the basics, but ideally we should maintain the way in which they lived previously so that they don't feel that they've lost their dignity. Once he provided a poor man with a horse and a slave to run before him, as was the custom. However, when he could not obtain a slave, he ran before the man himself for 3 miles. This is described in Masechet Ketubot. There are 2 ways, by the way, to read that Gemara. One is that he did that and wished to do that. One is actually he did that and wished to teach the person a lesson that when you do fall on hard times, you shouldn't expect to have a horse and a cart. You should be grateful to be able to have some food and a roof over your head. As if to say, he was saying, I will run ahead of you, but know that it shouldn't be this way. And you are almost overstretching the principle of Dei Machzoro Asher Yachsar Lo. That is about Hillel. Continues Gershom Beder. Hillel's modesty and unusual patience gained wide renown, and many interesting stories were told of futile attempts to make him angry, like I mentioned. Now, it is apparent from Shammai's behavior that he was careful to observe all the minutiae of the commandments. It is also evident that he did not interfere with the political situation in the country, and instead he devoted himself solely to the interpretation of the laws, in which he was seldom in agreement with Hillel. Remember, we discussed last week about whether it's better to stand aside when there is a toxic political atmosphere, or whether to do your best to try and rectify and make things better. Hillel sought broader vistas in his exposition, while Shammai clung to the literal meaning of the text, even in those cases where logic indicated it should be interpreted otherwise. So what we're suggesting is Hillel is a much more telescopic, broad-minded approach to Torah, and Shammai is a much more microscopic, more narrow focus in terms of the exegesis, application, and interpretation of Torah. Hillel sought the causes underlying the laws and critically analyzed previous interpretations before he arrived at his own conclusions. Okay. In time, these differences which have been pointed to, which the Gemara on Shabbos mentioned, these differences between the disciples of Hillel and Shammai increased, and it seemed as if there were two Torahs instead of one, for the claims of one school were invariably contradicted by the other. Do you remember I mentioned how already a few weeks ago, how the Zugot seemed to be very much on the same page, and as each generation developed, they seemed to become more and more distant from one another, like a pyramid. From the top, they're close together, and at the bottom, the sides are more distant from one another. This opposition reached such a state that on one occasion all the people were prohibited from leaving the academy on pain of death until a decision would be made whether Hillel or Shammai was a correct exponent of the law. This day, the Talmud states, was as difficult as the day on which the golden calf was made. The Talmud makes no mention of the results of that day, but on another occasion it relates that after many years of dispute, a voice, a bat call, announced that both contending sides are correct, but the law is in according with the teaching of Hillel, Beit Hillel. It is told that one of the latter Tanaim, Rabbi Talfon, repeated the Shema in the manner that Shammai prescribed, and soon after that he was beset by robbers. The scholars thereupon told him that he deserved to be in that danger because he deviated with the law, from the law of actually Beit Hillel. Most of the differences of opinion between the two schools centered about the laws pertaining to sacrifices, tithes, and the rules of purity. We'll actually come up to that in a second. Some sharp clashes arose in problems of marriage, which one school permitted and the other school prohibited. It might have been expected that differences of opinion on this subject would lead to accusations of illegitimate birth. But this was not the case, since both schools were tolerant towards one another and their disciples intermarried freely. So, by the way, there are lots of sources which discuss this and related issues. Obviously, we are having to restrain ourselves in terms of bringing a plethora of sources, but I presume that some of these ideas are already familiar. What I do want to note is that of those 300 plus machlakot between Hillel and Shammai, you can categorize them. And for example, of these arguments, about 220 revolve around various halachot, 66 are gezerot, and 29 are discrepancies over biblical and legislative interpretations. And despite Bet Shammai having the tendency to be strict, and Hillel towards lenient, 55 of these disputes, basically a sixth of them, is where Beit Shammai rules more leniently. By the way, I'm reading from a book here, which I haven't brought in our handout. It's actually about the Rogachover Gaon. It's a wonderful book by Rabbi Dov Ber Schwartz, fascinating read. And I'll talk a little bit later why he has something to say about Hillel and Shammai, that he does. And there's a little bit of an analysis about the breakdown of the 300 or so machlakot between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. So to remind you again, Hillel and Shammai disagreed on 3 or 4 occasions. Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai disagreed about 100-fold in terms of all those different areas that I just mentioned. Now, what prompted that devolution, which is a word I used previously, in terms of that lack of unity? Remember, Hillel was one, Ohev Shalom v'Rodef Shalom, but there seems to be more fracturing in terms of his disciples and that of Shammai's disciples as well. Well, says the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Misherabu Talmidei Shammai b'Hillel, from the time that there is an increase in number of disciples of Shammai and Hillel. It seems to be they initially had a handful of Talmidim, but then they had many more Talmidim. And those Talmidim who joined Shalosh Shimshu Kol Tzarchan, they didn't attend their masters to the requisite degree. Rabbi Machlokot B'Yisrael b'Nasek Torah K'Shtei Torot. We used that phrase before. Dispute proliferated among the Jewish people. The Torah became like two Torahs. Two Torahs meaning as if there are such radical differences in the Jewish people. Ki'ilu there was two Torahs. Chas v'shalom. You'll recall that when I was talking about Hillel, I mentioned how he served Shammai of Talion. And I mentioned the word shimush. That was part of his success. He was there. He was Meshamesh Shammai of Talion. Whereas the Talmidim, or the new waves of Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel, or Hillel and Shammai, weren't Meshamesh their teachers, didn't spend enough time with them, didn't attend to them enough, and it led to them seemingly not catching what was being taught, not fully appreciating and understanding what was being instructed, what was being interpreted, and thus their Talmidim, the Bet Hillels and the Bet Shammais, found themselves having many, many more areas of disagreement one with the other, despite the fact that Hillel and Shammai themselves didn't disagree on so many things. You've probably heard the phrase, Gadol Shimosha Yoter Milimuda. Greater is the attendance of the masters to simply learning from them. And this is based on this premise that Shimush is crucial. And this is something I've mentioned time and time and time again in our classes and in things that I write. We often think to learn is to learn the words of a teacher, but actually part of learning is being with them, observing them, understanding their manner, their ways. I was zeicher to spend quite a bit of time with my Rav, Dan Gershon Lopyan, just seeing how he paskened. Shailas relating to Nida. That shimush taught me how to pasken. It wasn't about the book that he was reading. It wasn't even necessarily about what he said. It was how he said. You learn how to carry the Torah Shebal Peh by observing people. I observed him, and where did he get it? He spent 5 months living with Moshe Feinstein, right? And he learned from... So that's what Shimush does. That sense of learning from your teachers, not just what to say, not just what is the right rule, but instead how to approach things, how to approach people, how to deal with particular situations. So the stark difference between the shimush of Hillel towards Shammai of Talion and the lack of shimush of the Talmidim of Hillel and Shammai, and thus Mishirabba Talmidim Shammai Hillel Shloshim Shetachan Rabbi Machloka B'Yisrael, that teaches us something that if you want to avoid Shtei Torot, if you want to avoid spiritual fracturing, if you want to avoid Machlokot, if you want to maintain that unity, the Achdus that Hillel spoke of, we need shimush. We need to spend time learning, heeding, listening, paying attention to others. So far, we've learnt about Hillel, we've learnt about Menachem, we've learnt about Shammai, we've learnt a little about Bet Hillel, we've learnt a little about Bet Shammai, we've learnt about the Tzach David, the Al Kisei Shel Zar, we've learnt about the Mishnayos, we've learnt why that Mishnah is in Aramaic, because it's about Menachem, and we not want to be Pagea, Herod, Herodas, etc., etc. What I want to do in terms of our conclusion is speak to the way in which people will categorize the reasons for those fundamental debates between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. So let's start off with saying the following. So I'm going to scroll up again. We saw the Gemara Masechet Shabbat that says the difference between Hillel and Shammai is that Hillel was Anvatan and Shammai was a Kapdan. And this explains why they disagreed on 3 or 4 occasions. And perhaps it also explains the basis of the disagreements between their schools of thought of the Bet Hillels and the Bet Shammais. Okay. But maybe there's more to it than that, because when you have 300 or 316, according to some machlokot, between 2 schools of thought, Surely it's not that there is individual reasons for each individual machloket, but instead, shall we say, a formula, a reason, a basis, a justification, a thesis which explains why all these areas were subject of disagreement between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. Meaning, is there an equation which explains why Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai are cholek on one another so many times? The short answer is many have attempted to offer an equation. You've probably heard, by the way, explanations as to the machloket, one of those 300 between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai about Hadlakas Neiros for Chanukah. Why does Hillel say you light one candle the first day and 8 candles the last day, and Shammai the other way around? And some people would say it's all about Ma'alim HaKodesh ve'Ein Maridin, all about the quantity or the quality, whatever. So there's a sefer that I mentioned when we started this course, and I think I've cited it before, and Kovetz Yesodot HaChakirot. It's a sefer which explains Talmudic concepts. It's a fascinating book. Now, the latest version doesn't have this bit, but the edition beforehand does. It has a section discussing the basis of machlakot between different scholars. And here, from pages 799 to 801, there is suggestions to explain why Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai disagree. And I want to read to you the bold bit at the top. Bet Hillel claims, poskim al pi mitziut. They seem to render halakhic decisions based on reality, based on the mitzias. Therefore, they pay close attention to the physical reality of any given situation. And so they make decisions based on the quantities of things, based on the presence of things, based on the events and actions and outcomes of particular things. In contrast, Bet Shammai, poskim al pi svara, they render decisions based on logic, not necessarily based on reality. I don't mean that Bet Hillel aren't interested in logic, but based on a certain conceptual framework. Therefore, they go according to the strict letter of the law, and they prioritize spiritual measures as the determinant for what should or shouldn't be done, and they make decisions based not on what has happened, but what may happen. Now, over these pages, and you're going to have a chance to look through this, you'll see references from different machlakot between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, which seem to explain why this is this category and why that is that category, which seems to explain what led Bet Hillel to say this and what led Bet Shammai to say that. We won't go into that quite right now. And as the pages continue, there's a little bit more of a breakdown. Poskim al pi ma shekara. They decide, according to Bet Hillel, based on what has happened. Poskim al pi ma sheyachol likot. They talk not just about the outcome, but instead about the potential. So here we're talking about Chanukah, we mentioned beforehand, and there's a little bit more on the next page, where it concludes by saying that Bet Hillel seems to render decisions, hagashmiut v'kamot hen ha'ikar, the quantities and the physical reality are the primary determinant factor, ruchaniut v'eichut hu ha'ikar. The spirituality and the quality is the ikar. So we have quantity and physical reality, quality and spiritual reality. And these, according to, and we're going to say in a moment, according to the Rogatchover, are the basis. This is the, shall we say, the equation which explains the 300 or so machlakot between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, and may well actually be reflective of the different worldviews of Hillel and Shammai themselves. Now, I mentioned the Rogatchover, and I mentioned this book by Dov Ber Schwartz, and I said that there's a large section about Hillel and Shammai. The Rogatchover was a tremendous Talmudist, and he had a fascination in the machlakot between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. And, in order to evaluate all these machlakot, you need to know them. meaning you almost need to have a mind which is a supercomputer to analyze 300 machlakot and trying to explain whether they can all fit within some kind of super theory. So the Sefer of the Rogatov is called Tzafnat Paneach, and from the Sefer Mafanech Tzfunot, which is explaining, this tells us the thesis of the Rogatchover, who has reached the conclusion and explains that what separates these two schools of thought are this, Gashmiut and Kamut versus Ruchniut and Eichut. And in this book, there is in English, because of course it's in Hebrew, there is in English quite a lengthy examination of what led the Rogatchover to these conclusions, all the different sources within many of those 300 machlakot, which prompted him and led him to reach his conclusion, including some of these which have been listed here below. What that basically tells us is that that while we have a clarity about the different personalities of Hillel and Shammai, while the Gemara itself talks about Hillel being Anbatan and Shammai being Kapdan, there are deeper, more systemic reasons which prompted the different outlooks of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, which may not have fully been reflective of the worldviews of Hillel and Shammai, because as we said before, they led to have many more disagreements. Shaloshim Shut called Tzarchan, because they didn't spend enough time learning from and observing and being with their teachers. Still, what the Rogatchover is demonstrating is that there is integrity, shall we say, for the worldviews of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, namely that there's a consistency. The word integrity is probably wrong. Consistency within those 300 machlakot, in terms of why Bet Shammai says what Bet Shammai says, in terms of why Bet Hillel says what Bet Hillel says. So let's now go back and try and wrap up, because we realize that what happens from Hillel and Shammai to Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai is a shift from being intentional ambassadors, shall we say, for the Torah Shebaal Peh, and protectors and transmitters. And then Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai almost kind of seem to have their own energy, develop their own worldview, inspired by their teachers, but perhaps also influenced by other factors too. And so overlapping that movement or those schools of thought, we then, and we're going to be seeing this next time, we then encounter the Tanaim. The Tanaim who realize that there's work to be done to be crystal clear about what is a halacha, what to do in which particular situation, what Masorah is being transmitted, and what decisions need to be formulated. So this period of time is tumultuous. We've gone from the Greeks to the Chashmonaim to the Romans, each zug responding to the needs of the hour. Hillel bringing the Torah from Babel and the language of Aramaic, and expressing his love and desire to democratize Torah. Shammai taking a slightly different view, each believing this is the way and the best way forward to the preservation of the Torah Shebaal Peh, and that debate is quite significant. And then their students continue to share their ideas, but also seemingly develop their own ideas, which then shapes the way in which they encounter and interpret a whole range of other halachic issues. So we've covered quite a lot of material. I imagine there's lots of questions that you may well have from what we've covered. Feel free to message me, and I'll be more than happy to hear from you. But I hope this has been of help. Again, thanks again for your understanding. I wish you well. Shavua Tov. And Be'ezrat Hashem, I look forward to us learning again together on my return. Kol Tov.